Coming up on Chasing the Natty, we've got even more transfer portal madness to cover, and today we'll be covering the position that might be the maddest of all this year, the wide receiver. In a year where so little returns to the position, can any of the 50-plus transfers we'll be discussing today offer us some guys to target? We'll find out. We've got all of that and more coming right after this.
Sellers picks his way to the right and is tripped up, reaching for the end zone. Touchdown. What a start.
Give it to Reed, and there he goes. Nobody's going to catch him. Touchdown.
It's caught. Jeremiah Smith. Touchdown, Ohio State. The legend grows.
This is Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. All right, welcome in everyone. This is Jared Palmgren, host of the Chasing the Natty podcast. Hope you guys are having a wonderful ride to your work on this Tuesday morning. We are the College Fantasy Football Podcast on the Campus of Canton Podcast Network. You can find us in all of your podcast feeds and on YouTube every Monday morning during the off season at 6 a.m. sharp. If you want to support the great work we do here, head on over to campusofcanton.com. Subscribe there with any of our phenomenal tiers. We got content ranging on all sorts of college football games, whether that is CFF, Devy, C2C, College IDP, College DFS. If you're just a nerd for recruiting, we've got it all. If you play it, then we've got content, whether it's tools, rankings, pretty much everything you need to succeed. In fact, right now, if you want to support the show even further, make sure when you sign up for one of our yearly membership tiers, you use that promo code NATTY, N-A-T-T-Y, to get 10% off your yearly membership. Again, that is promo code NATTY, N-A-T-T-Y. If you can't do that, totally fine. Just show us some love by leaving a like, a comment, and a subscribe on the YouTube side of things. If you're on the podcast side of things, just leave a 5-star review and make sure you are following the show. Not only does that show us support, but it shows the entire game of college fantasy football in general a ton of support. If you got any further questions or want to get in touch for whatever reason, you can find me in the show on Twitter. I'm at CFF_Jared. The show is at Chasing the Natty, and the handsome fellow joining me on the other side of the show here, you can find him on Twitter as well at FFChrisB. Chris Battistel, welcome to the show, man. Welcome back, man. How you doing?
I'm doing all right, Jared. Happy to be back. I guess I made the cut after that first week audition, so I'm excited to talk transfer portal, wide receivers, but most importantly, I am ready for spring and summer. Bring it on.
Yeah, we were talking before the show. I'm over here complaining about a half an inch to 3/4 of an inch of ice. Now, granted, that's a lot of ice. It's not the same thing as snow for sure, but we lost power for a little bit, hence why we had to delay the show for a bit. But you one up me, man. You immediately came back at me. You're like, yeah, by the way, I got like 14 inches of snow over the last week.
Sir. Yeah, it's. I'm over it. I'm over it. You know, we had the white Christmas. Snow at December is always fun, but January, February, I'm just sick of this snow. I'll take 3 to 4 inches of ice right now over 14 inches of snow and snowing every day. I'll take it, Jared.
You say that, but your local government's most likely prepared for 2 to 3 inches of ice rather than what we've got down here. You don't realize down in the Southeast, we have a singular salt truck that is shared between multiple states. All right, we're not prepared in the slightest for any of that kind of stuff down here. All right,
dear.
Dude, we had exploding trees. Down here. It was crazy.
Oh, no.
For those that don't know,
dear.
The water inside of trees, turns out when it gets cold enough, it'll make trees explode. Just if you didn't know that, now you do. So, a lot of fun stuff going on down here, but thankfully. Oh, actually, not thankfully. I was about to make a joke about how cold this position is in terms of there just not being much for us to go on this year. So I guess it's not a good thing. Not thankfully at all. Chris, let's talk about wide receivers in general a little bit this year. Not a lot coming back from last year. Like, let me take a look at what we got returning. If my screen would load up here, please, and thank you sometime today. There we go. Yeah. So we got 4 elite guys coming back. You know, Bo Sparks, Malachi Tony, Easton Messer, Jeremiah Smith. And, you know, KJ Duff and Murray Thomas are in there as well. But we got a lot of guys transferring out. We got a lot of guys leaving, man. Yep. Like Skylar Bell, Mekhi Lemon. Eric McAllister, Camden Brown, Junior Vander Ross, Casey Concepcion, Gabriel Benier, like all these different guys just gone, 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 gone. I think this is probably the thinnest I've seen the wide receiver position in quite some time. Are you kind of feeling the same way?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. For my C2C teams, I kind of like the graduation aspect of the college football wide receivers moving up. But for my CFF dynasty or CFF in general, it hurts, man. It hurts when you're trying to build a roster. We're in the midst of the way too early mock right now, and it just seems like you're throwing darts in the fourth, fifth round at some of these wide receivers. So it's slim, but I'm kind of excited to see who's going to be the next man up.
Yeah, I think we'll see, at least compared to last year, because last year it was really, Jeremiah Smith and Jordan Tyson in the first round. Maybe you snuck Easton Messer into the first round. I wouldn't be surprised, especially with how deep running back is a little bit this year, if we don't see some of those, a couple more wide receivers, or even half of the first round in some drafts, end up being wide receivers, taking those guys like Smith, Messer, Tony, those, Sparks, those really early on guys there. So we'll definitely see. Where the backfill comes in, though, for this position is hopefully a lot of these wide receivers landing at good spots, and we've had a ton of movement because of that. So we'll get all over into that, but first, a quick message from Austin, our overlord over at Campus Canton. He's got a couple of great companies that he wants to tell you about, so we'll get to that, and then we'll be right back with you guys.
Hey guys, Austin here to talk for a brief moment about Home Field Apparel, the best place to snag clothing for all my favorite schools and teams. Whether it's tees, sweatshirts, hats, joggers, or pretty much anything in between, Home Field Apparel has retro designs with a modern twist to satisfy fans from Ohio State to Drexel to Colorado School of the Mines. Plus, it's some of the comfiest clothing that I own. Use our promo code CAMPUS2CANTON, that's campus, the number 2 Canton at checkout, for 15% off your first purchase. What's up, guys? Austin here again to let you know about our partnership with Fast Draft, a best ball and DFS platform that hosts a ton of different contests. With the season over and season-long CFF best ball behind us, I know I'm looking for new contests that can scratch my drafting itch, and I think I have found just the thing. Fast Draft has a rookie-only contest called Origins. Each draft has 8 teams in it and is 6 rounds long. And as I've mentioned earlier, you only draft incoming 2026 rookies. I know I plan on max entering this thing, and I think it's going to be a ton of fun. So head on over to Fast Draft, and when you sign up, use code C2C, that's C2C, for a deposit match up to $50. Happy drafting.
All right, thank you very much, Austin. And before we get to wide receivers, we got to do a little portal catch up here, Chris. We got a couple of guys finding some spots, specifically at the running back position. A lot of interesting spots to follow this past week. We got one more quarterback who found their final spot. No, it is not Darian Mensah, believe it or not. We got a different guy. But let's start with the running backs here. Chris, let's start with Mekhi Frazier out of Michigan State, heading over to Ole Miss. Really, I don't have much to add here out of just, it's kind of unfortunate. He went from being the RB1 at Michigan State, where he was, pretty solid, if not a little bit banged up, right? Michigan State was a bit of a mess of a team last year. He got out of there. That makes sense. But he goes to Ole Miss. I think he's RB2 at best behind Lacey there. It's a pretty solid backup option for Ole Miss, grabbing him to put behind Lacey for sure. But if you were hoping for him to land somewhere where he's going to be the guy, you don't like this at all. What do you think real quick?
Yeah, I'm on the same page. He's just going to be a depth role piece for Ole Miss this season. And I'm not excited. I'm probably not going to own any of Mekhi Frazier unless I'm looking to either fill out the back end of my running back room with the, I don't even want to say hopes in this spot, but with the insight that Kawan Lacey either goes down or misses some time, Frazier's going to step up. So if I'm filling out a best ball team and I'm looking for my 10th or 9th, 8th running back, I might just put Mekhi Frazier in there.
No, I think that's definitely a good call because like I said, I think he'll end up being the RB2 behind Lacey, and we've already seen that he can be the RB1 for a team. Now, is he going to take on the workload like maybe Lacey is able to, where he's out there for 75% of the snaps? Probably not. But
Yeah.
at the same time, like, I agree. Like, if you're just trying to fill out a best ball roster and you really don't like the running backs that fell to you towards the end, why not fill it up with a contingency plan like this? A more
Yep.
interesting name here potentially is Gavin Sawchuk, the running back out of Florida State, previously Oklahoma before that. He is now headed to all teams, Northwestern.
Ooh.
Not really a team you would think of for a guy that was, a former 4-star, borderline 5-star talent, but, he's headed north, where he's going to butt heads with Caleb Kumalafe here. Kumalafe,
Yep.
pretty solid the last 5 weeks of the season, touchdown in every game those last 5 weeks, 100 plus in 3 of them. He was really setting himself up to be the clear guy at Northwestern moving forward, and to me now the question is, does Sawchuk kind of come in and mess that up? I think we've seen enough personally of Sawchuk to know that he's not going to come in and just unseat Komolafe as the RB1. It's his 5th year in college, and the best we've had was towards the end of his 2nd year of college. So I think the idea of Sawchuk being a clear RB1 for a team, especially after 2 stops now, pretty done. It's just, does he eat too much into Komolafe to make Komolafe a lot less interesting moving forward? How are you navigating this, Chris?
I'm not too worried about the transfer into Northwestern. I think Komolefe is going to be great for fantasy. He might take a hit. His ADP might drop a little bit considering the news of Gavin Sawchuk. But like you said, Gavin Sawchuk is not this elite, at least not anymore, this elite running back where he's going to go into Northwestern and they're going to split the carries 50-50. In my opinion, Gavin Sawchuk's going to be in there, and he's just going to be a rotating running back to just spell Komolefe, give him some time on the sidelines, maybe a little bit of change of pace, but I'm definitely not fading Komolefe too much, man.
All right, third running back we'll discuss here. This one, personally, I'm the most excited about, and that is Darrell Robinson, the former running back out of Auburn, and before that, UConn, and before that, Charlotte. This is his 4th school, which normally isn't a great sign, but hear me out here. We all kind of lamented when Jim Mora went to Colorado State, and he could not convince Cameron Edwards to follow him, right? That sucked. In fact, of all of the RB options that could, only Mel Brown actually followed Mora from UConn, which, is a little interesting in and of itself, but there's another reunion here, and that is Darrell Robinson, who is now returning to Mora's system. The last time these two were together was at UConn in 2024, and they were really making magic back then. Like, Robinson was the RB3 on that system, but he was tearing off nearly 7 yards a carry. He was averaging over 4 yards after contact per attempt. He had a breakaway percentage of over 40%. It was enough to get Auburn to notice him and say, like, hey, come up to the SEC. Yeah. Now, clearly that didn't work out super well. He only had 3 carries last year, and now he's realizing, yeah, maybe I should move back down a level of competition. And he's going to reunite with Mora here. Like, again, Robinson, like I said, RB3 that season for Mora, deep in the committee, which included Cameron Edwards and Mel Brown. But when you kind of break this room down, I am a little worried about Mel Brown until I realized what exactly Mel Brown was. Mel Brown very much fits your scat back role. He's 5'9", 180 pounds, much lighter guy. Meanwhile, Darrell Robinson, much beefier, 6 foot, 207 pounds, matches much more of what we saw with Cameron Edwards, who is about 5'11", 210 pounds. So Darrell Robinson very much fits that beefier bruiser role, and I think that's the position that he is going to take in this offense. Mm-hmm. Mora made a pretty interesting switch last season when he suddenly made Edwards a workhorse rather than going with his typical committee approach. It really becomes down to, do we see that again this year? If we do, I think Darrell Robinson is going to be a great value in drafts. If they go full committee again, that's just going to suck no matter what team you're with. But Chris, how are you viewing this transfer in here?
I can see a situation where Darrell Robinson ends up the goal line back. The quarterback's obviously going to eat into some of that touchdown production that Darrell Robinson could see. I don't see him getting too much of the reception work, like you said, with the other running back that is there. So he's kind of, for me right now, an RB3 with potential back-end RB2 upside if he sees multiple carries on the goal line. So I'm not excited for Darrell Robinson, but I'm enthused to see what the reports are going to be coming out in spring practices and the spring games. And then as we head into fall, how the room starts to take shape.
Yeah, if I start getting word that Robinson's the clear RB1, I'll be moving him up my rankings pretty dang quickly.
Yeah,
I mean, Cam
absolutely.
Edwards finishes the RB10 last year. Now, granted, he doesn't have like the super volume that you would kind of expect, a top 10 RB to have. Like Edwards was extremely efficient last year. Good news, Robinson's also historically been a very efficient back, but I agree with you. The big capper of his ceiling is going to be Haas Haney. We know for a fact he can run. We know for a fact he's going to be a lot more mobile than Joe Fagnano was. Even though Joe Fagnano got what was it, 5 touchdowns last year, something like that. Even still, like Haas Haney is going to be a much bigger pain in the side for Darrell Robinson here. Next guy up here, Braden Bennett, former running back out of Virginia Tech. Before that, Coastal Carolina. Now headed back to the G5. We always love that move. Going to Eastern Michigan. This is definitely one that kind of caught my eye. Like I said, moved to the Power 4, just did not work at all. He had 4 carries for 8 yards last year at a touchdown. Not even really a factor in that Virginia Tech running back room at all. The last time we saw him at the G5 level was at Coastal Carolina, where he had 132 attempts for 789 yards, so 6 yards a carry, and 11 touchdowns. That's pretty solid. And he's headed to Eastern Michigan, who is in need of replacing their 1,000-yard rusher from this past season, Dante McMillan. And a lot of you might be thinking, like, Eastern Michigan, that's not a super attractive spot. I'm like, I don't fully blame you for thinking that, but also they've been quietly very productive at running back, right? Like I said, Dante McMillan, 1,000 yards, only 4 touchdowns last year. That sucks, but that could be remedied. The year before that, Delbert Mims, 184 carries, 810 yards, and 9 touchdowns. He was pretty solid, especially in the second half of the season there. And if you go all the way back to the first year that Mike Piatkowski was the offensive coordinator, probably would have had a workhorse back then if, Samson Evans didn't run out of gas his senior year there. So I'm kind of interested in this. I think Bennett could be a really interesting running back for Eastern Michigan going into his final year here. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Jared. You're always going to want to invest in some of these G5 guys to round out your rosters. And Braden Bennett going into Eastern Michigan with the history of the running backs at that program, there's a good opportunity where Bennett sees RB1 workload and could reach that 1,000-yard plateau, possibly get close to 10 touchdowns. And if that's the case, he's going to be a delight for fantasy managers.
For sure. Last guy we'll catch up on here from the other positions is Alberto Mendoza, the quarterback out of formerly Indiana, now headed over to Georgia Tech. Yes, this is the younger brother of Fernando Mendoza. And quite frankly, I think GT's got their quarterback here. I think they've looked at what he's done over the last couple of years there at Indiana. And, with the limited time that he's been able to get, Indiana goes out and gets Josh Hoover. So Mendoza's like, I'm not sitting around another year. Georgia Tech is completely vacant at the quarterback position. Let's just go there and see what we do. And at first I was kind of sitting here thinking like, oh man, I don't really know I don't know what the offensive coordinator in George Godsey prefers at Georgia Tech, whether he prefers statues or if he prefers mobile quarterbacks. I have no clue. And then I figured when I looked at Alberto Mendoza's history, that I wouldn't be able to really tell what kind of quarterback he is. And to a degree, that's partially true. But if you believe the PFF breakdown, 154 yards of Mendoza's 180 rushing yards last year came on designed rushing attempts, not scrambles, designed rushing attempts. The fact that we're getting that many designed runs for Mendoza tells me that he's a pretty mobile guy, right? And that they're putting that into his playbook there. And it was a pretty big part of his playbook because he didn't get a lot of snaps, and a lot of them ended up being rush attempts by him. And so that tells me that he'll be a rushing threat at Georgia Tech, even though, like I said, at George Godsey, complete unknown at offensive coordinator. We'll see. I think that if I'm reading that correctly, and Mendoza is a lot more mobile, even than his brother, right? And we get a dual threat quarterback at Georgia Tech in the ACC. Mendoza might be worth taking a shot later on. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, and we mentioned it last week. At least Georgia Tech's got their quarterback. Justice Haynes doesn't have to throw the ball, so he'll be a little bit
That's
more
true.
leaned on to run the ball. But it's gonna be interesting to see how he progresses as the starter at Georgia Tech, considering that pass catching options, there's not many good ones. So they're going to rely on the legs, I'm assuming, of Mendoza at GT this year. So I'm like you. I'm an optimist, but I'm not overly optimistic with what his production is going to be.
All right, I'll throw out some more names here that did find a home here. Emory Jones, the quarterback out of Miami, headed to East Carolina. That's probably, I would guess, East Carolina's starting quarterback next year. We'll see. Tay Meadows, just flat in our face here. Former running back out of Troy is headed to Auburn. He'll probably be the RB3 at best there. That's very unfortunate. Donald Chaney Jr., who was deemed academically ineligible before the start of last season, would have been Charlotte's RB1. He entered the portal after the season. He's actually headed to UL Monroe, and we do like those Bryant Vincent RB1s over there. I'm not saying Chaney's going to be the RB1, but that might be one to keep an eye on there, especially with Zach Palmer-Smith and Braylon McReynolds headed out of there. Kanye Udo, the Arizona State running back, headed to Liberty. That Liberty backfield has quickly turned into a mess over there. And then Antonio Martin, the former Kansas State running back, is now headed to Middle Tennessee State University, who is in need of replacing Jakyle Middlebrook. So that might be one to keep an eye on there. Chris, you got any quick thoughts on any of those?
I don't know what Kanye Udo's doing going to Liberty, man. How do you not look at that depth chart, look at the other recruits that are coming in there and be like, yeah, I want to go to a program. I want to go to a team where I have to compete with 6 to 8 other running backs. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Unless he's getting a decent check, that's the only thing that I could see. But production-wise, fantasy-wise, he was productive at ASU. We did get some decent games out of him. But going to Liberty, that whole room is clouded, and I'm probably going to own no Liberty running backs this year. Yeah, that's what it is for me.
It's going to end up being a repeat of last year, right? Where we just don't know anything going into the season. And even the guy that probably starts the season isn't going to be the guy that's ending the season, right? Like it's just going to be who's a hot hand throughout the season, and maybe one guy fully takes over at one point, but we're not going to know during the preseason. So, all right.
Unfortunately, I wish we did.
I know, right? I wish I had a crystal ball that just told me everything, but here we are.
We do not.
Let's talk about some wide receivers, man. Let's get to that here.
Let's get into
it. And as we always do on these transfer shows, we got about 10 really rooms more than like specific wide receivers that we're going to talk about here. Again, some of these will have only one guy on them, but for the most part, we're discussing rooms here because a lot of these teams, they don't just add one guy. Of course, they got to add multiple. So let's try to discuss as many as we can here. Excuse me. As many as we can here. And we'll start with the Arizona State wide receiver room. Obviously super important because Jordan Tyson, who was the wide receiver 11 in fantasy points this past year, he's really top 4 before he tried to go one more time at the end of the season and just broke fantasy hearts everywhere. He was also a top 12 wide receiver the year before. Arizona State's obviously been very good for him, but he's gone. So that becomes the question of what goes on with these two transfers they brought in here with Amari Miller from Colorado and Boston College wide receiver Reed Harris. Do either of these guys come in to be the Tyson replacement, or is Arizona State wanting to kind of spread things around a little bit more than they have in the past? History tells us the likely answer is the latter, right? Like it's very often when we have an elite option like Tyson on a team like Arizona State that isn't used to really providing first-round caliber wide receivers, that we'll see a drop-off afterwards, right? Unless one of these guys fully takes over immediately, it's most likely they're going to spread the ball around a lot more than they were. However, I do think it is very interesting that Arizona State grabbed 2 wide receivers who, in my opinion, have teased some pretty elite upside here, right? Like Miller at Colorado, hyper efficient for 3 years. Like clearly a deep threat option with a high ADOT, high yards per catch. He's been 17 plus yards per catch in all 3 years that he's played college so far. His yards per route run the last 2 years have been 4.24 and 2.57. The 4.24 is an elite number. 2.57 is a great number. And even better, you look at that great efficiency, and he's going to Arizona State here. He's not even leaving the conference that he's been doing that in. So you can expect him to be able to still do that as long as they give him those opportunities. Meanwhile, Reed Harris, similar in a lot of ways, averaged 20.4 yards per catch in his college career so far. He's just a monster target. 217 pounds, 6'5", like very much that big, deep, go get it guy on the outside there. Both these guys have high athletic star indexes and numbers. There's a lot to like here, Chris. The question is, can either one of them be, like, which one would you bet on to be a guy you would draft in CFF?
Jared, this could easily turn into a two-man job where Amarian Miller moves the offense, gets him into the red zone, and Reed Harris, the 6'5" wide receiver, becomes the touchdown target once they get there. Neither one is going to give you much after the catch. Miller was the 81st ranked wide receiver in yards after the catch. Harris, the 163rd ranked wide receiver in yard after the catch. So a small percentage of their total yardage came once they got their hands in their ball, once they got the ball in their hands. So their production is going to be heavily tied to the QB play and the target quality. And that's where the problem starts a little bit for me. Cutter Boley from Kentucky last year, we are assuming he's going to be the QB1 for Arizona State. He was atrocious at pushing the ball downfield, 42 total attempts beyond 20 yards, and a 19% completion percentage on those throws, according to PFF. So that's not a great look for either guy if the offense can't create explosive downfield completions. The key here, in my eyes, is going to be who's going to end up playing more slot snaps for
Arizona State.
Sorry, there's too many teams.
You're totally good, man. I'm there too.
For Arizona State this year, Reed Harris did spend quite a bit of time at Boston College playing out of the slot, so it could be a situation where, like I said, Amarian Miller gets them down there. Reed Harris is used as the big body slot wide receiver for ASU. So in this room, I'm going to chase the slot usage, not the big downfield catches, because I just don't think Cutter Boley is going to be able to get it to Amarian Miller efficiently enough to make him a viable weekly fantasy asset.
So counterpoint on Cutter Boley here.
Yep.
His top wide receiver last year was Kendrick Law. His second wide receiver is Harley
fair.
Gilmore, the fourth. Like, Kentucky was giving him nothing to work with last year. Like, I mean, Jamori Macklin was there as well, but he kind of faded away big last season for whatever reason. Like, they weren't giving him much to work with last year. Meanwhile, if you have a guy who is struggling to pass downfield, you might as well give him two giant targets in Amarian Miller and Reed Harris, two great deep threat options, right, that can win those contested one-on-one balls. So I have faith. I just don't know exactly where I'm going to feel comfortable grabbing these guys. I know at least one of them was taken in our way too early draft. Again, more on that in a couple of weeks for you guys. We'll tease that. But in terms of like how I'm gonna draft these guys, yeah, I don't know exactly where it's gonna fall. If I just go off raw projections, these guys are both gonna be, top 20 wide receivers for me. But I know I can't draft them like that, so we'll see how that falls. How would you handle that, Chris, off the top of your head?
I'm probably going to lean towards Reed Harris a bit more because I think you'll see more of the target share.
Where would you draft him?
For ASU? I would say top 30. I don't know if I'm going to put him top 20, either of them right now, but I would say top 30.
Okay. Sounds good. All right, let's throw up our next guy here. We'll start our third North Texas to Oklahoma State headliner we've discussed in as many weeks. It makes sense. These guys were awesome last year for fantasy. They all follow the system that made them great. I feel like a broken record at this point when I talk about, like these guys did the best thing they possibly could. They, moved from the ACC to the Big 12. They followed their head coach. Like everything seems lined up for these guys. And with Wyatt Young, the wide receiver we're talking about here, given the fact that he was a top 4 wide receiver in CFF last year, even with the change, you got to think it's hard to keep him outside the top 10 in your rankings, right? Like, you have to think, like, he has one of the safer floors in CFF again this year. However, once I really kind of dove into his numbers and really kind of thought about it, you want to talk about a guy that truly hit his absolute ceiling last year, it was Wyatt Young. There were so many things that went right for him last year. A top 4 wide receiver he was last year. He only has 79 targets in the regular season. Normally, for a top 4 wide receiver, you're kind of expecting about 100 plus options, even 4 deep outside guys, right? So, like, getting a top 4 wide receiver out of 80 targets, pretty impressive, but also very unsustainable, right? He also, of those 79 targets, caught 78.5% of them. That's impressive. That's even for a slot wide receiver who you expect to have a higher completion percentage. That's pretty dang high. And then he was playing out of the slot, so that kind of explains it a little bit there. But your average slot receiver, you're kind of expecting around about 10 to 13 yards per catch, right? Your elite ones can get upwards of 14, 15 yards after per catch, especially if they're good after the catch. Young had 19.4 yards per catch last year. Like, again, just a crazy efficient performance from a slot receiver. Yeah. Like I said, truly the epitome of somebody who reached their absolute ceiling of abilities last year. And don't get me wrong, he might just be that good, right? And he could do it again this year, right? But history says it's unlikely he keeps all of that up, especially with a move up in competition here. So just something to keep an eye on with Young. Again, I still think he'll have one of the safer floors of CFF this year, but I think people need to be careful drafting him as if he is like a clear-cut guy to finish in the top 10 again this year. And another thing to really note is that while Eric Morris brought, Wyatt Young and Miles Coleman over from Oklahoma State, they also managed to land some other wide receivers. Chris Barnes from Wake Forest, Justin Bowick from Illinois, Rodney Harris from Ohio. These are some guys that I do think could kind of compete for some of those targets that would normally just go to Wyatt Young next year. We'll see. Chris, am I just being too much of a Debbie Downer here, or what are your thoughts on Wyatt Young here?
I'm in the same boat with you, Jared. He was a legit weapon after the catch. 59% of his 1,200 receiving yards came after the catch. He was damaged with the ball in his hands, and he's not just a slot guy either. 16% of his target share came downfield. 3 of his 10 total TDs came on those deeper balls. But the thing that surprised me the most when I was looking into his production last year through week 7, so all the way up through week 7, he had 294 receiving yards. The final 6 games, he put up 909 yards.
Oh, God.
So if you were to expand that through, or the word I guess is extrapolate, is that the proper terminology?
That is the proper time. Oh my God.
For the whole season, I mean, who knows what he could have been. He ended up with 1,200 yards. He had the highlight games, the one against Rice where he went off for 295 on 8 catches, 2 TDs. He put up 190 versus Charlotte, 3 TD game versus UTSA. He's following his coach, like you said. He's following his quarterback, who he became the favorite target for. This is probably one of the cleanest transfer portal wide receiver bets in the whole portal. And I'm okay investing early draft capital on a player like Wyatt Young because of the situation that he's in, moving up to Oklahoma State with the right recipe around him to continue to build on that success of last year. I mean, those numbers, the back half of the season were just absolute madness.
Absolute madness, but again, like I said, for me, it feels a little unsustainable. But just because I'm saying that doesn't mean I think he's going to be a bad draft pick by any stretch of the imagination. Mm-hmm. Now, if he's a first rounder, maybe I avoid that a little bit, right? But in terms of, just grabbing a guy that I feel like is going to be a very safe floor going into next year, I don't think you can really do much better. Let's move on to the guy that is probably rated the number 1 wide receiver transfer in most services here, and that is Cam Coleman, the wide receiver out of Auburn, now headed over to Texas. This recruitment was absolutely insane to follow. The NIL bidding war that was rumored around this was just nuts. By the end of everything, the rumor was that his NIL for this year is north of $4 million, which is just straight up QB money that this man was getting. Like, hey, good on Cam Coleman. Like,
good on Cam Coleman.
The guy earned it. But now he lands at Texas here. So what can we really expect here? And to me, I kind of approached this from like a worst case scenario and best case scenario. At first, I wasn't really big fan of this transfer, as I kind of told you, Chris, when I was initially putting the show sheet together. But then I kind of thought about a better case scenario here that very much could make Coleman a worthwhile pick in drafts this year. Which one do you want me to start with? Worst case or best case scenario here?
Let's give me the worst case and then let me down gently with the best case.
So worst case scenario, I think we get an amped up version of 2024. Right? That's the year where Arch Manning or Quinn Ewers starts his final season. By the time the regular season's done, the top wide receiver on that team had 58 targets. Right? Split amongst a bunch of good options here. You know, the freshman Ryan Wingo, you got Matthew Golden, you got DeAndre Moore, you got Gunnar Helms as your tight end option there. Like, they were splitting it all around the field. I think we could end up with that this year. And, you know, I say amped up because I think it's still in the worst case scenario. I mean, you're paying Cam Coleman $4 million. Like 75 targets, I'm thinking, is probably worst case scenario for Cam Coleman, maybe 70. And that still can get you a solid year, especially for a guy as talented as Cam Coleman, but it's still going to leave you a little bit wanting. Best case scenario, in my opinion, though, is that we get an amped up version of 2023, the year before. That was the year where Xavier Worthy and Adonai Mitchell were the top two guys, right? And that would mean in this upcoming year, we get a two-man operation between, you know, Cam Coleman and then Ryan Wingo. Because Ryan Wingo's not going away, right? Like, Ryan Wingo had 90-plus targets last year for Texas. Like, he's not going to sit there and just not be heavily involved next year. Otherwise, he'd probably be in the transfer portal right now. So, if we look at that year in 2023, that was when Worthy got 103 targets in the regular season. So please, for the love of God, give Cam Coleman that many targets, and I think we'll all be super happy.
Yes, sir.
But even then, like, Adonai Mitchell had 75 targets. I think I could see that happening between those two potentially of, you know, Cam Coleman gets like 95 targets. Ringo gets about 80-something targets in the regular season. Both of them are pretty happy. It's a two-man operation. And especially with the money they're paying him, you have to think that we're probably leaning a little closer to this 2023 version. What do you think, Chris?
Yep. Yeah. I think we get closer to the 2023 version. The Auburn environment was brutal for the pass attack last year. Jackson Arnold finished 113th in pass attempts, and his yards per attempt was only 6.1 yards. Coleman's best games came when they benched Arnold for Ashton Daniels. Daniels in his 4 starts had 50% of his pass attempts that Arnold had in 8 games. So that's a big, massive volume difference for Cam Coleman and Auburn's offense in general. If you pace that out, if you pace Coleman out with Daniels for a full season from that 4-game sample size, he would have hit 100-plus targets, 800-plus yards, and about 30 more fantasy points. And that puts him in range with Cooper Barkate, Jacob DeJesus, and Chris Bell, a much more respectable finish for fantasy. He's going over to Arch Manning, who was top 25 in pass attempts. He was one of the top QBs in pushing the ball downfield. I believe 11 of his 24 touchdowns came from throwing the ball at 20-plus more yards. So I'm expecting Coleman to step into the role of Ryan Wingo last year with the chance of a higher touchdown total than he had this past year. It's a talent bet. He's a talented guy. He's getting an upgrade in QB. He's getting an upgrade in offense. So there's big chance for him to break out as a stud wide receiver for fantasy. So I'll have Coleman if the price is right. But if he's getting just too expensive, if his ADP is just too high, if he's going top 10 wide receivers, I'm just not going to invest in them at least early spring. As drafts move on and we get closer to summer, fall, and we can really tell what his role is going to be like a lot of these other transfer guys, I'll be more inclined to spend a little bit more of that top end draft capital on a player like Cam Coleman. So I'm betting on him in this situation to have a better year than he had at Auburn.
I think so as well. Again, just like you said, the improvement in the quarterback play is going to help him a absolute ton. It's just a matter of he's also sharing a room with Ryan Wingo and, you know, Emmett Mosley still hanging around. They added 2 pass catching backs in Raleek Brown and Dalen Smothers, and so like we'll see. We'll see. But again, it's Steve Sarkisian's offense. In Steve Sarkisian, we trust. Speaking of offenses that we trust, let's go talk about the wide receiver situation at LSU, man. Talk about an absolute overhaul of this room. Lane Kiffin leaving no stones unturned. I got 3 wide receiver names up on the screen right now, and that still doesn't quite cover the amount of guys that Lane Kiffin's added to this room. But we can talk about what I think are going to be the 3 main ones here in Jace Brown, the Kansas State wide receiver, coming over to LSU. Eugene Wilson, the former Florida wide receiver, headed over to LSU. And then Jackson Harris, our boy from Hawaii, was the first to commit to this room. And he is headed over, of course, to LSU as well. I'll let you start this one, Chris. Between these 3 guys, which one are you buying?
I'm buying Jace Brown. Base standpoint, Jace Brown, Jackson Harris are the more highly regarded fantasy producers, but Eugene Wilson is no slouch. Wilson's 2023 season left you wanting more at Florida, but we just never got it out of him. We're all expecting LSU's QB1 to end up being Sam Leavitt. It may finally be the year that Wilson shines, but my money is on Jace Brown breaking out as the lead slot wide receiver for LSU. As you can tell from the previous talking points from wide receivers, I'm not a big fan of quarterbacks that struggle to push the ball downfield. And looking at Leavitt's numbers from the past season and his career in general, he's not one of the most accurate passers when it comes time to pushing the ball. 31.2% completion percentage, and only 13% of his attempts were downfield last year. Even with a projected NFL first rounder like Jordan Tyson, who lined up primarily outside, most of his production came from cutting across the middle and into that intermediate and below the sticks area. And Leavitt's best year, 2024, 66% of his total passing yardage came from pass catchers creating after the catch. And I know this is a wide receiver episode, Jared, but you can't paint the picture of wide receiver success without using the quarterback as your paintbrush. And when it comes down to Sam Leavitt pushing the ball downfield, the guy's finger painting. So I'm going to be light on Jackson Harris just because of that situation with Sam Leavitt. I'm going to be heavily invested in Jace Brown, and I'll buy Eugene Wilson at his ADP.
Yeah,
where are you at with it?
Well, it'll definitely come down to where all these guys are, but I'm with you. I'm buying Jace Brown out of the 3 here. He's been super impressive with Kansas State the last 2 years. I think he'll slide right into that Lane Kiffin wide receiver 1 on the outside. So long as he can stay healthy, that's kind of been his major issue the last couple of years. He kind of gets banged up, especially as the season goes down. But, 17 yards per catch this whole year, very efficient, above 2 yards per route run. Those are 2 things I always like to see there. Yep. Obviously, I hear you on the Sam Leavitt deal, but counterpoint, Sam Leavitt's now working with Lane Kiffin, who might be one of the best developer of quarterbacks and one of the best offensive play callers in the country. Lane Kiffin's going to be able to tell him just through the headset, like, hey, your outside guy's going to be open. Just throw it up to him. He'll go and get it, right? He'll know exactly when to do that. I'm not really too excited about buying Eugene Wilson. I think things have just been trending the wrong way for him for years now. 2 of his last 3 years, he's averaged less than 10 yards a catch, which means he's going to have to be a target merchant in this offense, and that's just not what Lane does with his slot guys. I actually think there might be a chance that Winston Watkins, who was pretty great as a true freshman last year, overtakes Eugene Wilson as the season goes along, if not outright starts over him before the start of the season. I don't know if that's a hot take or not. I don't know. Eugene Wilson fans out there can tell me or not, but I do think I'm also slightly interested in Jackson Harris if I buy him at the right price. I hate the fact that he committed to LSU so quickly, and then all these other guys came in. It just made it feel worse and worse and worse. I'm like, man, you could have just gone somewhere where you could have been the guy. But I do think it's possible, like I was just talking about, Jace Brown, he gets banged up sometimes. Maybe Jackson Harris can take over that. I'm not entirely sure. It is such a big jump from Hawaii to LSU, though. Like, I wish he went somewhere better. But, if he's cheap enough, I'll take some shots there, potentially, as well. But Yeah, that's the LSU wide receiver. And again, like I said, this is not even touching on all the guys here, right? Like Trey Brown is like from Old Dominion is a guy they're bringing in. Trying to think of some of the other they brought one of the wide receivers in from Troy, Mothershed. Mothershed's coming in from Troy. Like they brought in so many different guys, just sucked them all up. And Lane's definitely going with we'll throw whatever at the wall and see what sticks here. I'm hoping it's these three guys though.
Yeah. Agree. At least Chase Brown.
At least Chase Brown. I think Chase Brown's pretty safe. I would be shocked if he is not one of the starters. So
agreed.
Let's move on to our two wide receivers going to Cal, and that is former Rutgers wide receiver Ian Strong and former Ohio wide receiver Chase Hendricks. Cal, as we kind of touched on throughout this portal season, kind of been impressive with the names they've been able to land in this cycle. Again, we'll talk about Dorian Thompson next week. We talked about Adam Muhammad the week before. These are the two wide receivers they brought in, and they are very nice new toys for JKS to play with here, especially with them losing Jacob DeJesus to the NFL here. But there's kind of competing thoughts in my head here, right, on which one of these guys, in my opinion, is the one to own. And I do think there's going to be only one guy here to really own. There's two ways I can go about this. We'll start with Chase Hendricks, who's second on the graphic, but we'll start with him. Obviously, the downside here is we are moving up in competition from the MAC to the ACC, but the big upside is that he's going to be playing in the slot, which is one where Jacob DeJesus was at last year. Obviously, that's where JKS is used to looking. And even though Jordan Somerville, who's the new offensive coordinator, is a pretty big unknown in terms of what kind of system we're going to run here, the fact that Nick Rolovich, and this is something pointed out by Nate Marquise in one of his latest articles, so shout out him for pointing this out, Nick Rolovich was promoted from just offensive analyst to QB coach. I think that could have some pretty big influence on target distribution here, and if that is the case, the slot is not going to only get peppered, the slot is going to be fully seasoned like your Thanksgiving turkey. Like, the amount of targets to the slot under Nick Rolovich is actually so insane. Chris, under Nick Rolovich, when Nick Rolovich has major influence in an offensive system, it is more likely that you see two slot wide receivers as the top target getters in the system than it is for a slot and an outside guy to be the top two wide receivers in his system. In 3 of the last 4 years, the top two wide receivers have been slot guys. So if that happens, that's obviously big ups for Chase Hendricks, but not so great for Ian Strong here, right? Ian Strong, very much an outsider. 90% on the outside at Rutgers. But then there's that itch in the back of my head that says he was already a 1A, 1B combo at Rutgers. Why would he come to Cal to be anything less? Right? And especially since he's moving down to competition here, I like the spot for him. I think Ian Strong is actually the more talented receiver here. Again, his numbers have been great the last couple of years. But again, it's one of those things here. Like, what do we go with here? Do we go with the perceived system play with the slot wide receivers, or do we go for the talent play in Strong? How do you want to navigate this, Chris?
Everything you said there with the slot. I'm going to be drafting a lot of Chase Hendricks. I don't think he gets the full 140 targets that we saw DeJesus get last year because Strong is there. It was really only DeJesus and not really much around him competing for those targets because they brought Strong in. I could see Strong get a healthy amount of targets, but I'm still going to be holding on to Chase Hendrick. And with the outlook that he's going to be the fantasy leader for this team. And he is stepping up in competition coming from Ohio, moving to Cal. But if you look at what he produced last year at Ohio, those first 3 games was against Rutgers, West Virginia, and Ohio State. And in those 3 games, he put up 312 yards and 2 touchdowns on 20 receptions. So the guy can play up when it came time for him to do so. He struggled a little bit near the end of the season, but kind of picked up pace near the end. And he's walking into a wide receiver room where they just finished top 10 in pass attempts. You got a pass first QB in Sangapulu Tele going into year 2, looking to build on a solid freshman season. He's coming from a QB in Parker Navarro, who was a run-first QB. I think he had 138 attempts rushing last year. So it's looking promising for Chase Hendricks to be the guy in this offense. And I'm not going to be afraid to pull the trigger. I'm not going to be too shy drafting him, even though he's moving up in competition. So for me, it's Chase Hendricks going to be the guy in this offense. Then I'm going to go Ian Strong. And then if I'm looking for tight end, Dorian Wilson is there as well. So they got a good group of pass catching options for JKS in his second year. But my money for fantasy, at least, is going to be on Chase Hendricks.
You know what? You might have convinced me a little bit there. I think I'm still going to end up with Ian Strong ahead in the rankings because I don't. If the slot position is that important, like Ian Strong, let me look him up real quick. He is how big are you, Ian? Ian Strong.
And even Chase Hendricks, bigger bodied wide receiver.
I would say Ian Strong 6'3", 211. That's not exactly your typical guy that you would put in the slot. It's actually really big for a slot receiver. But even still, like if it's that important to the system, right? They're gonna find ways to put their best guys into the positions that they, like you said, like Ohio was doing the exact same thing. Chase Hendricks was an outside wide receiver the year before he moved to the slot for his final year there at Ohio, right? Could very well be the same thing, and both these guys could play in the slot, and we'll see what happens from there. But I agree that, again, there's an argument to be had for both of these guys.
Absolutely.
So, let's move on here. Let's talk about Trey Richardson, the wide receiver who was a freshman last year at Vanderbilt, now headed over to Louisville. And you guys know what I'm going to say here. We want the Jeff Brom wide receiver 1. It's been so crystal clear year after year for CFF. The Jeff Brom wide receiver 1 is going to help you in fantasy, right? Chris Bell last year, 106 targets in 11 games, 917 yards, 6 touchdowns. Touchdown numbers weren't great. Efficiency wasn't great, but it's 100 targets, right? You're going to want that. Ja'Cory Brooks the year before, 93 targets, 61 catches, 1,013 yards, and 9 touchdowns. He was great. Top 24 wide receiver. Jamari Thrash, 84 targets in 11 games and 6 touchdowns, 791 yards. He was great until he got hurt about halfway through the season. And then the year before that, Chuck Sizzle, Charlie Jones, 138 targets in 12 games, 12 touchdowns, just under 1,200 yards. And then David Bell the year before that, 11 games, 133 targets, 1,275 yards, and 6 touchdowns. I could go back even further. Like Jeff Brom wide receiver 1s are the guys you want. Now, I will say they have diminished a little bit since he's gotten to Louisville, mostly because he's had such great running backs and he doesn't need to throw the ball as much as he did at Purdue. But we're still getting really solid wide receiver production, even with guys like Isaac Brown and Kejuan Brown going to be leading the backfield this year. So I'm still targeting this room. And to me, Trey Richardson's the guy I'm looking at here, right? Very impressive as a freshman. At Vanderbilt, 72 targets, 46 catches, 806 yards total, 17.5 yards per catch, 7 touchdowns. And again, that includes all 13 games there, not just the regular season games. Just regular season, he was just under 700 yards, 6 touchdowns there. He mostly played outside at Vanderbilt, and like I said, just absolutely killed it. If he gets this outside role at Louisville, which is where typically we've seen the most production come for Jeff Brom's wide receivers, really Rondell Moore being the main exception there, you got to like the upside here. It also helps that Richardson's athleticism is absolutely fantastic. He has a 91.7 star index in our athletic comparison database. The big drawback I would say here, though, is that even though he played on the outside, just kind of small for an outside wide receiver. He's 5'10", 175 pounds on a good day, right? Meanwhile, all the guys I mentioned before, with the exception of Chuck Sizzle, who is 5'11", all those guys were above 6 foot, right? So maybe this becomes like a Rondale Moore situation where they bring in Richardson, move him to the slot, and they just use him the same way as Rondale Moore. I don't know. Maybe I got to be looking at who could be on that outside there. But I ask, who? Who else is his competition here? Like, because they lose Bell, they lose Lacey, they lose Julio Skinner, they lose Antonio Meeks, they lose Trayshawn Hurry, they lose DJ Collins. Like, their top 5 wide receivers, they're all gone, right? And the only other option they brought in was the guy from Florida State, I forget, LaWayne McCoy, right? A guy who hasn't really done much. Like, Richardson was a much more impressive wide receiver than LaWayne McCoy last year. So I gotta ask you, Chris. Like, I kind of want to go all in on Richardson here. Am I jumping in too quickly here?
No, you're not jumping in too quickly. It's for me, it's going to come down to quarterback play. Yeah, Miller Moss only threw 14 touchdowns last season, so it wasn't exactly fireworks. If Louisville gets anything solid out of what is looking like Lincoln Kienholz to be the starter, Richardson can be a steady fantasy starter, like you mentioned. It's a role plus volume bet, and I'm buying into him being a wide receiver 2-3 in 2026. He closed the season strong at Vandy, and it wasn't just empty production. The final stretch, 5 TDs, 358 yards on 15 receptions against Auburn, Tennessee, and Kentucky. So there was some stout competition there, and it was just throwing up green flags for me. Of course, at Vandy, the offense, at least the pass offense, went through the tight end position in Eli Stowers. So him moving to Louisville with the history of the outside wide receivers, with the history of even Rondale Moore, like you mentioned, in the slot, I am not going to be afraid, just like you, to invest heavily into Trey Richardson in Louisville. I'm going to have quite a bit of shares of Trey.
Am I crazy if I tell? Oh, not. I guess I can't be crazy. These are just pure numbers. But Richardson, if I just go by pure numbers, top 6 wide receivers in my early projections here.
Hey, yeah, I'll take that. I'll take that.
Because
his ADP, at least early, his ADP is going to be, I think his ADP is quite low.
Yeah,
right now.
We'll definitely see. But like again, this is part of the benefit of us not having a second portal window, because we can't even sit here and say like, oh, well, Louisville's going to add somebody in the spring, right?
Somebody else. Yep.
Nope. Now I'm going to go take a second look at the recruiting class this year. I'm going to go make sure they're not bringing somebody in who could come in and just absolutely, shake things up really quickly. But as of right now, Richardson's the guy, man. I'm excited.
Yep. You have every right to be.
Let's move on to our next wide receiver here, or wide receivers, I should say. And that is the duo that is headed to Oklahoma, right? We got Trell Harris out of Virginia and Parker Livingstone out of Texas. Livingstone's a fun one. You always love those inter-rivalry transfers right there. But, Chris, you've listened to my show long enough. When I talk about Ben Arbuckle's system, what is the one thing I always talk about?
That's a good question. I'm drawing a blank right now. You put me on the spot.
The slot, right? I always talk about the slot wide receiver, and I always want the Ben Arbuckle slot, right? We always focus on the slot, and we should, right? It's one of the most consistent positions in the entirety of CFF. We saw it last year with Isaiah Satania, and we'll see it again this year with Satania. He'll be off in the first 3 rounds of most of your drafts, right? Well ahead of either one of these guys. However, when Arbuckle's system is clicking, there's room for an outside guy to emerge as well. We saw it even a little bit last year. It was the worst that we've seen in a while, but we saw it a little bit last year. Deion Burks, 86 targets, 58 catches. Right? Year before that, Kyle Williams, obviously a monster season for him. 86 targets, 1,024 yards and 13 touchdowns. Josh Kelly, the year before that, 92 targets in 12 games, 933 yards, 8 touchdowns. Dawood Davis, back when we were at Western Kentucky, 12 games, 95 targets, 863 yards and 7 touchdowns. Year before that, granted, Arbuckle wasn't the offensive coordinator, but he was very much a quality control guy and very much copied that system. Mitchell Tinsley, right? 12 games, 94 targets, 1,127 yards and 10 touchdowns there. Again, like I said, when this system is clicking, there's room for an outside guy. And while everybody's rightfully drafting Satania high, if you nail the second wide receiver here, especially now that Arbuckle and Mateer and everybody have a second year to get ready for the SEC grind and everything like that, I think you can get yourself a deal. Of these two, I happen to like Trell Harris. He got his chance to be wide receiver 1 for Virginia last year, and I thought he looked pretty good. Again, 83 targets, 847 yards, 5 touchdowns. Could have done more on the touchdown realm there, but you can't always control that. And given that Oklahoma's wide receiver room is just a mess right now due to years of failed recruiting, I mean, Nate Marquise put out a fantastic stat here that in the 3+ years of Emmett Jones recruiting in Oklahoma, like all the wide receivers he recruited, how many yards between all the guys he recruited over his 3+ years there are returning this year? Total yards, career yards. How many, like 3+ years of wide receivers he recruited there? How many yards are returning this next year?
I'm gonna go with 0.
36. Not quite 0, but
Oh, it's close.
but 36 total yards between 3 years of wide receiver recruits is returning to Oklahoma this year. That room is wide open. And so to me, that tells me Trell Harris and Livingstone are both going to have a pretty immediate impact here. But I'm willing to put my bet on Trell. He's older. Livingstone was the 5th wide receiver option for Texas last year. I highly doubt he's going to jump and all of a sudden become the wide receiver 1 for Oklahoma, unless Oklahoma's that petty and they're really ready for Livingstone to stick it to Texas. But Chris, what do you think of these two guys? Are you going to be drafting either one?
Honestly, I don't know what to make out of either of these two guys. Like you mentioned, Harris, the older, more experienced player. Livingston has the height advantage, but that for me, that's where it stops. The positive for Harris, building on his first year at Virginia after moving up from Kent State, is exactly what you want to see from a wide receiver making that jump. Livingstone's 2 100+ yard games at Texas were propped up by long receptions versus San Jose State, 128 receiving yards, but 83 of those came on one play. Versus Arkansas, 104 receiving yards, 54 came on one play. Outside of those chunk plays, Livingston was basically a non-factor. I'm not really inclined to draft either of these guys. I'm even less interested in Livingstone. I'll probably invest a little bit into Trell Harris just because of the situation that he's walking into and how wide open the room is, like you mentioned. But other than that, I might just invest in Livingstone off the waiver wire when Oklahoma plays Texas, but that's probably the only time I'm going to roster him.
That's fair. You know for a fact they're going to try to get Livingstone at least 2 touchdowns that day.
Yeah, exactly.
No, like I said, I'm Harris might be a guy I'm putting my flag on pretty early. That again, while everybody's drafting Satane, again, rightfully so in the first couple of rounds, I'll happily take Trell Harris as my wide receiver 3-4. And we'll just go from there.
That's fair. That's fair.
So. All right, let's move on to our 8th spotlight wide receiver here, and that is Mr. Caden Lee out of formerly Ole Miss, now headed over to Missouri. This is a guy that, man, he's coming off a year where it looked like, he'd be set, but he underperformed, and not really just our expectations. And don't get me wrong, we in the CFF community have some pretty lofty expectations for the guys we draft, but he just underperformed his entire stat line from the previous year, right? Less targets, less receptions, less yardage. He was less efficient than the year before. He did have one more touchdown than he did in 2024, but really that's the only thing you could point at and say it was an improvement. So very much a disappointing year for Caden Lee last year. And because of that, he leaves Ole Miss. And he doesn't do what a lot of Ole Miss guys have done and follow Kiffin, right? Instead, he's going to follow a different connection of his, and he's going to follow his former best friend there in Austin Simmons, who is the expected starting quarterback for Missouri. Missouri, pretty in need of wide receivers after Kevin Coleman and Marquise Johnson have both left. Even Horatio Fields, who was part of this year's portal class for Mizzou, is now rumored to be leaving because of Lee's addition. And so Lee's kind of helping clear that room out. He'll have to compete with Donovan Olugbade. Making sure I
nailed it.
I was like I had to pause for a second to make sure I got that right. Donovan Olugbade. But if Simmons and him still have that connection there, you have to imagine that he'll be funneling some targets to a lot of targets to Caden Lee there. I wouldn't complain about that whatsoever. So Chris, how are you kind of feeling with Caden Lee here going to Mizzou?
I'm not overly excited, but my expectations are high. My expectations are low, but my hopes are high. Okay. And hope is not always the best strategy, especially when talking about fantasy football and trying to pinpoint which one of these guys are going to be efficient enough for you to roster or start on a weekly basis. He finished 4th in total targets last season at Ole Miss as the starting slot wide receiver, which isn't overly impressive. He averaged 7.35 fantasy points per game. For his career, he's averaging 6.5 fantasy points per game, so not hot. He's walking into a new situation with offensive coordinator Chip Lindsey, and the slot usage history is what makes this interesting. Lindsey's 1 year as Michigan offensive coordinator, slot wide receivers combined for 90+ targets. Going back to North Carolina. Nate McCollum was the top target in 2023. In 2024, tight end. It was a tight end, but he was the big slot and finished second in the team on targets. Like I said, my hopes are high if he can walk out with 70 plus targets, 600 plus yards, and around six-ish touchdowns. He's good opportunity to create fantasy points for managers. But I think that's his cap. That's his ceiling. I'm also a believer, like you said, Austin Simmons. He's following Austin Simmons to Mizzou. But the production that they've had together in this very small sample size that we had with Austin Simmons starting for Ole Miss early last season, 3 receptions, 21 yards. So it's not exactly inspiring. I'm not drafting him as a breakout, but I will draft him as a cheap slot volume bet, and I'm going to pick him up at the back ends of my draft. So hopes are there, but expectations are low.
Yeah, he ain't gonna be there. I'm telling you right now. Again, a lot of people are gonna lock in on this connection.
High? Yeah,
okay. And quite frankly, I don't fully blame them because you're talking about how you view his ceiling as 70 targets ish and stuff like that. I mean, these guys got a pretty good connection. I agree with you. The start of last year was not inspiring whatsoever, but I could potentially see here 85 targets. And, give him, 780-ish yards and 7 touchdowns. That's pretty. I think that's a pretty solid stat line for him. I think it's reasonable expectation. I'm not asking for 1,000+ yards here, right? But this is definitely going to be better than what he was going to be dealing with at Ole Miss, right? Like, again, things were trending the wrong way there. Might as well put him back into a position where he's now choosing his spot. And he could have gone other places. He could have gone to LSU. He could have gone to Georgia. He chose Mizzou. Right, he wants to be with his boy there with Simmons. It's just a matter of, does he walk in and is he the clear best wide receiver they have day one, or is Luke Bidet going to be a legit challenger for him? Now, if Simmons just wants to funnel targets to both Luke Bidet and Lee all season long, and both these guys end up with 85, 90 targets, I'm totally cool with that. But again, we'll see just how realistic that is. So, all right, let's keep moving on here. We got a lot to get through and still so much time. Actually, no, strike that, reverse it. So little time, so much to get through. Nick Marsh, wide receiver out of Michigan State, formerly Michigan State, now headed to Indiana. Indiana obviously coming off their national championship. Congratulations to all the Hoosiers out there, right? They're going to lose a lot. Right, they had a very old roster. They had a lot of guys that are going to be moving on to the NFL after the season or just be straight up out of eligibility. And that includes their top 2 wide receivers in Elijah Surratt and Omar Cooper, who we are now confirmed Omar Cooper is moving on to the NFL. Those 2 were wide receiver 15 and wide receiver 21 in fantasy points per game last year. The year before that, Surratt was wide receiver 41, and the year before that, back at James Madison, Surratt was wide receiver 19. Now that Cignetti's system's pretty established there in the Big Ten, I'm willing to bet that we'll see some top wide receivers for CFF pretty consistently out of there. I'm kind of doubtful we're going to see 2 guys every year, kind of like we did this past year, especially since so much of it relied on Omar Cooper just having ridiculously efficient performances. So I'm a little worried that we're not going to be able to get 2 guys, but there's a pretty good, they're putting themselves in a good position to be able to do that again, because they're going to have quite the duo in Charlie Becker, and then now they're bringing in Nick Marsh here, right? Marsh has been a pretty big Devy favorite for the last couple of years now, and most have blamed his lack of production so far on the fact that he's just been stuck at Michigan State, which pretty fair, right, on some level. And then last year, a lot of people blame the fact that he dropped pretty much across the board in efficiency, despite the fact that he got 97 targets with Michigan State, on the fact that he was playing injured most of the year, from what it sounds like. And so, they're excuses, but they're, in my opinion, kind of valid excuses. So now he's going to probably the best situation he could go to, right? Going to Indiana. We know Kirk Cignetти loves putting up points, right? That's the one thing about Kirk Cignetti, is that he is not going to take his guys out until much later in the game. And he's going to make sure his guys get theirs. And as we've seen the last couple of years, he's willing to funnel touchdowns, especially to 2 different guys. So, Chris, like I said, I'm doubtful that we're going to get 2 guys here. So between Becker and Marsh, who I imagine are going to have pretty similar draft capital, which one would you rather go after?
I'm going after Marsh. He was one of the more interesting wide receivers on this list. He was productive at Michigan State on a team that didn't throw all that much. Aiden Childs was the 117th quarterback in pass attempts, and Marsh commanded a staggering 48% target share. So for me, going into an offense with Josh Hoover, he's getting a better quarterback play, 20 plus touchdowns back-to-back seasons, nearly 10,000 passing yards through 3 seasons, 1,100 pass attempts. He's stepping into the right environment. He's going onto a team, like you said, they're going to compete. They're going to throw the ball. I like the player. Becker came on back half of the season. First half of the season was really non-existent. So I'm expecting Marsh to walk into Indiana and be that wide receiver one for the Hoosiers and be the go-to target for Josh Hoover. So I like the player, and at ADP, he looks like he's going to have a strong 2026. So I'm betting on Nick Marsh a lot.
It'll be interesting because as of right now, I expect both these guys to have similar draft capital. If there starts to be a divergence between these two at any point, I think I will go after the guy who is going a little bit later in drafts.
Okay.
Right. I think these guys are relatively even in terms of being able to, in terms of their upside. Right. Again, like we established before, a lot of people are really big on the fact that Marsh is going to go to the NFL one day. That's how they feel about the Indiana wide receivers this year. And so if you believe that, you expect him to be the wide receiver one here. I personally have liked a lot of what I've seen from Charlie Becker this year. He's going to have a year up, or he's going to have a leg up over Nick Marsh in terms of the fact that he's been in the system for a year. He was huge for Indiana last year. I mean, again, one of the most important catches of the season came from Charlie Becker against Penn State in that game there. So I have to imagine he's going to be rewarded quite a bit as well this year. I personally, as of right now, would rather have Becker and Marsh if they're similar in ADP just because of that year leg up. But I also don't blame people for really liking Marsh. We'll have to see. Last spotlight wide receiver combo we're going to look at here is Darrell Gill and Jonte Cook, both coming from Syracuse, headed over to Ole Miss, who's, again, going to need to replace quite a bit in that receiver room. They're losing Dejon Stribling, they're losing Harrison Wallace, they're losing Caden Lee, they're losing Daquan Wright. So much losing. They'll get Deuce Alexander back, who's pretty important. But we've seen from the last 2 years that offensive coordinator here, John David Baker, who's been at East Carolina, typically sees two guys getting targets, right? One outside guy and one slot receiver. He happens to be bringing in here a combo of Darrell Gill, an outside wide receiver, and Jonte Cook, a slot wide receiver. They were both decently productive at Syracuse last year, despite the fact that they were doing it with a mess at the quarterback position. Doesn't even begin to describe what Syracuse had last year. So you're hoping that they have a better shot here at Ole Miss. Between these two guys and Deuce Alexander, who's coming back, who is obviously sticking around at Ole Miss by the coaching change, how are you viewing these guys, Chris, between these, all three of these guys?
For me, given the production that they had last year, Cook 7.7 fantasy points per week, Gill 8.2 fantasy points per week, both respectively. Gill caught more touchdown balls. So I'm going to be picking and leaning on Jonte Cook because touchdowns aren't that sticky of a stat to predict. I'd rather chase targets and repeatable production. And Cook's yak profile is what separates him for me from Gill. 204 yards after the catch, nearly 50% of his total receiving yardage. And then that shows up on fantasy. That's 50.5 fantasy points from yards after he catches the ball. Gill, on the other hand, only 10 fantasy points from yardage after the catch. So he's not doing much once he's getting the ball in his hands. He's not manufacturing fantasy points for you when he is getting the ball. Like I said at the top, he caught more touchdowns. So if Jonte Cook can increase his touchdown total by just a little bit while continuing to see a bulk of the targets, I think that Jonte Cook is going to be the wide receiver to own in this wide receiver room. even looking at to further expand on that Daryl Gill's game where he had the 9 targets and 152 receiving yards, only 23 of those yards came after the catch. So big play wide receiver, but big plays are going to come few and far between on a team like Ole Miss with a expansive wide receiver room. So for me, I'm going to chase Jonte Cook over Daryl Gill, at least between these two wide receivers. But I'll roster both.
So I'll ask you, Chris, again, you're talking about chasing targets and versus chasing touchdowns and stuff like that. The average between the last 2 years for John David Baker, right, at East Carolina, the slot wide receiver has averaged 70 targets versus the outside guy has averaged 85 targets. Does that change your opinion at all?
Not necessarily. It changes it a little bit, but I'm still gonna chase Jonte Cook in this situation at Ole Miss.
Again, Jonte Cook does have kind of the talent advantage a little bit. He, again, former 5-star wide receiver, hasn't always kept his head on straight and everything, but the talent's definitely been there. It's flashed pretty much every year that he has played college football so far. Hopefully now here at Ole Miss, he can finally land somewhere and very much show off that talent here. So, real quick, if you're listening on the Campus Again Podcast Network, we're going to throw you guys over to commercial break real quick for a quick ad from Prayer Profiler. But rest of you, we'll see you guys here in just 1 second. All right, we are back, and let us move on. Chris, we got to go rapid fire because we are already an hour 20 into this. Boy, we got a lot to discuss still. 5 wide receivers up on the screen. I'll go pretty quickly through these. Audric Harris, wide receiver formerly of Washington, a former 4-star wide receiver there, headed over to Hawaii. We got Landon Sides, a wide receiver out of North Texas, headed over to East Carolina following his offensive coordinator from North Texas to East Carolina. Jaden Barnes, wide receiver out of Appalachian State, who seemed like he scored a touchdown every single week last year. He is leaving App State and headed over to Charlotte. We got Keyshawn Singleton, the wide receiver out of South Florida, headed to Auburn, obviously following his head coach, Alice Golish, as well as his quarterback, Byron Brown. And then we have Chase Sowell, the wide receiver out of Iowa State, headed to Penn State following head coach Matt Campbell there. Chris, I'll start this one off. I got 2 guys I really want to discuss here. Probably 2 guys that people are kind of scratching their heads on, being like, why are these guys 2 of the first wide receivers we're talking about in this rapid fire segment here? But man, people got to be aware of Audric Harris. Audric Harris is going to Hawaii. Obviously, Hawaii needs to replace outside production from Jackson Harris, right? The run and shoot needs a good outside wide receiver. Sorry, y'all. I'm not doing the Pofele Ashlock thing again. I'm tired of it. He's just a target monster, and that's it. He has a couple good games here and there, but he's never going to be that guy for Hawaii. Meanwhile, Audric Harris reuniting with his former high school quarterback here in Michael Alejado. They went to high school together. They seem very excited to play together. I think that there's a much better shot that Audric Harris becomes the wide receiver 1 for Hawaii this year, and I will happily take that discount, even if it's just at the start of the season, for Audric Harris and not draft Pofele Ashlock one bit. I'll go for Harris almost every single time. And then the other wide receiver I want to discuss here is Jaden Barnes, that wide receiver out of App State, headed over to Charlotte. I think people kind of forget, especially since Charlotte didn't have a great year this past year. Tim Albin is the head coach over at Charlotte. He was the head coach at Ohio before that point. And if you knew anything about Ohio and that offense they ran there, slot wide receivers all day long. Javen Nicholas this past year, 84 targets in 12 games. Coleman Owen the year before, 113 targets in 14 games. Sam Wiggless, 90 targets in 12 games. Sam Wiggless the year before, 98 targets in 14 games. You want that slot wide receiver, right? Javen Nicholas is gone. He's off to Duke. We'll discuss him in a second. Jaden Barnes is your replacement wide receiver here. He is going to be in that slot position. He was a touchdown machine last year. Very solid for App State. I think he'll slide right into things here for Charlotte. The only thing we need is good quarterback play. And that is a big if, right? And we also need them not to lose their starting running back like literally 2 weeks before the season. That would help as well.
That was rough. Yeah.
But, if Parker Navarro gets his, 19th year of eligibility, like who's to say maybe Navarro doesn't come over to Charlotte here? Everybody assumes he'll go Power 4, but maybe he goes to Charlotte. I don't know. Reunites with Tim Albin. again, that's we're far out with that one. But Chris, you got thoughts on any of those guys, and then on those two guys, and then anybody else you want to talk about on the screen, please feel free.
Yeah, I mean, Jaden Barnes, great bet considering all things considered with the amount of targets he had last year, like you mentioned, and the role he's stepping into on Charlotte. Keyshawn Singleton, high potential for output with the connection that he made with Byron Brown last year. Byron Brown really took a step forward, pushing the ball downfield. I believe he was top 5 in pass attempts over 20 yards. So that's very promising considering the 2 years before that, it was the slot wide receiver at USF that soaked up a lot of the targets. And then you got Chase Sowell, found his stride late last season after moving up from ECU, where he spent most time as a starter, following his coaching staff in QB. My current projection for Chase Sowell, 35 receptions, 450 yards, and 3 touchdowns. So obviously not a world beater, but if you need a guy in certain situations to plug into your lineup, or you're looking for a best ball wide receiver at the end of your draft, Chase Sowell might be that guy for you. So I kind of like Audric Harris. I didn't know about that. I actually didn't know about that high school connection with Micah Aliato. So that's kind of pushed him up the board a little bit for me. So yeah, I'm good with all 5 of these guys.
Chase Sowell is interesting to me because, obviously he didn't live up to expectations at all last year, but I'm expecting a big jump from him. Jaden Higgins made a pretty big jump in his second year with Matt Campbell, right? Now, granted, Higgins also had a better year 1 than what Chase Sowell did. I mean, Chase Sowell only had, 59 targets, 500 yards, and 2 touchdowns last year. Higgins had 80 targets and 900-something yards in his first year, so obviously it's not quite apples to oranges here, but he still made a major jump after that, right? He went from having 80 targets to 129 targets the next year, 50 extra targets that next year, right? Just an absolute monster jump in terms of volume there. I'm not saying that's going to happen with Chase Sowell, but I do think that having a second year in the system is going to help out Chase Sowell a lot. Like you mentioned, he was a lot better the second half of the season than he was the first half. Yep. I think that, what do you say? Your projection was 400 yards for him? You think he's going to finish with less yards?
450.
You think he's going to finish with less yards than he did last year?
Yeah, I do.
I would. If I was a betting man, I am a betting man, but I would take that bet. I would take the over on that. Yes, it is another jump in competition here, going from the Big 12 to the Big 10.
Yeah,
you have to think that they're going to be very reliant on him in this transition, right? They're going to be reliant on the guys that have been in the system for quite a while, or been in the system for a year plus now. My projection is definitely lofty. Again, just raw numbers, we're looking at almost 850 yards, right? Like that's I know. I said I got to find a way to dial that back a little bit, but at the same time, we know Matt Campbell will feed number 1 wide receivers. Maybe last year it was just not quite there yet. Now he's got another year under his belt. Maybe he can make a big jump. We'll see.
Yeah, and like you said, the back half of the season, the fact that he built onto that first half and he started coming on, that's very promising. So
if you were to, after the first 3 weeks of the season, if you were to tell people that Chase Sowell would still finish as the number 1 target for this offense at the end of the year, people would have called you crazy because he just wasn't even getting on the field the first couple of weeks. So again, we'll definitely see.
Yeah.
All right, next group of wide receivers here. Javon Robinson, the former wide receiver out of Georgia State, headed over to Utah State. Speaking of Utah State, the former star wide receiver there in Braden Pagan is transferring up to Utah. Then we got a duo of wide receivers in Kenny Odom and Bryson Rogers headed to South Florida, joining Brian Hartline there as the new head coach. Yannick Smith, a favorite in the C2C community, is now headed up to the Power 4. He is headed to SMU. And we also got Nick Anderson, the former wide receiver out of LSU and Oklahoma. He is headed over to Kentucky. So, Chris, I'll throw it over to you, man. What guys interest you here?
I like Javon Robinson going over to Utah State. He was the starting slot for Georgia State last year. 83 targets, 600 yards. He's walking into the starting slot role for Utah State, whose starting slot wide receiver was second on the team in targets with 88. But Brady Brady Boyd, who was that player, had a lowly 53% reception rate. Robinson had a 70% reception rate, which is a huge upgrade. So it's really going to come down to QB play in that situation. Nick Anderson going from LSU to Kentucky, was hoping for a bit more at LSU. If he can get back to his breakout year at Oklahoma, there is potential here. He has familiarity with the OC, new coaching staff coming from Oregon, and LSU is promising another wide open room, which could turn out, and Nick Anderson could turn out to be Minchie's guy. You mentioned Yannick Smith, big-bodied wide receiver with a potential for a high amount of touchdowns. And then you can never discount Brian Hartline, the new head coach at USF, and his eye for wide receivers. We've seen what he's done recruiting the guys at Ohio State. So, and Kenny Odom was great at UTEP. I don't think Bryson Rogers is going to do too much, but the QB situation is going to be the one to watch at USF this year. So I don't really have a take too much on Rogers. Won't own any of them early in drafts, but I might own some Kenny Odom.
Yeah, no, this is a very interesting slide here. There's a lot you can kind of go with. I mean, to add on to Javen Robinson there at Utah State, you talk about just what they did last year. Let's forget about last year because that OC is gone. Let's talk about the fact that Robert Ernay is reuniting with Bronco Mendenhall there at Utah State. Yeah. And when Robert Ernay is offensive coordinator, boy, he loves a slot. He loves himself some slots, right? They're not wide receiver 2 for him. They're wide receiver 1. Casey Concepcion, 88 targets his final year at NC State. Casey Concepcion the year before, 105 targets in 13 games. Year before that, when Robert Ernay was at Syracuse, is Ronnie Gadsden technically tight end? Yeah, I know. He was their slot wide receiver. 93 targets in 13 games. And then the year before that at Virginia, 12 games for Keaton Thompson, 112 targets in that year. Like, Robert Ernay loves feeding a slot wide receiver. And quite frankly, Utah State doesn't have anything else in this wide receiver room. They got some young guys that they're kind of looking at and everything like that, but they didn't get anybody else out of this portal, right? Robinson was a big get for them. They needed a good slot wide receiver. I think he's going to get fed quite a bit next year. I like Robinson, especially probably where he's going to go early on in drafts right now. Braden Pegan, I loved him last year. The good news is he is following his OC, even though he is moving up in competition. He's going to Utah. Utah needs some help in that wide receiver room. They lost quite a bit in the portal with, why am I blanking on the head coach's name, or the former head coach's name now at Michigan? Kyle Whittingham. Kyle Whittingham was able to draw a lot of guys into the portal there, so they need some help at wide receiver. And I think that Braden Pegan knowing the system, should fit in quite a bit there. You already mentioned the USF guys. They brought in more than just Odom and Rogers. Like, they also brought in Amar Branch. They also brought in Cameron Sullivan. But these are the two guys I'm interested in the most. One, because Rogers knows Heartline's system coming in from Ohio State, so that'll be super interesting to see if he can lock down one of those outside positions there. He'll also have a talent advantage over a lot of the guys playing in the American Athletic. And then Kenny Odom, man, I just like Kenny Odom. I think he played extremely well at UTEP. Just has been kind of shafted by injury, shafted by the fact that UTEP's just not a really good team. I think that if there's any coach that can really work with Kenny Odom, especially if Kenny Odom goes into the slot, it could be really, really good. I think both of those guys could be really, really nice grabs late in drafts, especially, like you said, if they get that quarterback position right. And then Nick Anderson, I completely forgot about the connection with the offensive coordinator. I was thinking Will Stein the whole time, but you're right. There is the connection with the offensive coordinator there. Combine that with Will Stein's love of top outside wide receivers like Troy Franklin, like Zachary Franklin. Hopefully Nick Anderson, if he can just stay healthy, could be that guy this year, and it could be huge. But also Kentucky could be the worst team in the SEC, and that could be a big problem.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's move on to our next set of 5 wide receivers here. We'll start with the duo headed to Colorado. Really 3 guys headed to Colorado, but I kind of took one off because I don't think he'll do much this year. But that's Danny Scudero, the top wide receiver from this past year. Never mind, he was top 3. Top 3 wide receiver for CFF this past year. He's headed to Colorado. DeAndre Moore, wide receiver out of Texas, he's also headed to Colorado. This one's just strange to me because like Colorado needs to replace their outside producers like Amari and Miller. So of course they go grab 3 slot wide receivers out of the portal if you include Cameron Perry. That makes sense. Regardless, they're headed to Colorado. We got a trio of guys headed to Virginia. We talked about it earlier, Chris, about how Virginia has had kind of a sneaky good amount of volume for their top wide receivers recently, with Trell Harris gone, Deshaun Martin out of Kent State, Rico Flores out of UCLA, and Jaquan Gibson, the wide receiver out of UMass. They're all headed to Virginia. Could we get a sneaky guy to come out of there? I don't know. Marquise Johnson, the wide receiver formerly out of Mizzou, is headed over to Mississippi State. Mississippi State is losing Brendan Thompson. They need a new outside wide receiver. We'll see. Eric Singleton, formerly wide receiver out of Auburn, headed to Florida. He is reuniting with Ben Arbuckle, who was his offensive coordinator back when he played at Georgia Tech. We'll see how he kind of competes with Vernell Brown and Dallas Wilson there. That's a really solid trio of wide receivers for an SEC team, so we'll see how that goes. And then Kenny Johnson, wide receiver out of Pitt, headed to Texas Tech. Yeah. Texas Tech's losing both of their outside guys. Between the two of them, that's 144 regular season targets vacated. Obviously, he won't inherit all of that, but I think he's somebody to keep in mind. Chris, I just kind of gave my general spiel on all of these guys. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, out of all of them, Kenny Johnson's probably the one wide receiver out of this whole slide that's walking into the best QB situation with Brendan Sorsby. He was productive at Pitt, 72 targets, healthy yak production. And Sorsby is not afraid to push the ball downfield. He was top 15 in balls, deep ball passes, so balls after 20 yards or more. Eric Singleton, it's a room with still Vernell Brown and Dallas Wilson, so I'm not too sure what he's going to be, and I'm not too sure what Aaron Philo is going to be as the potential starting quarterback for Florida. And then Martin, Flores, and Gibson, I've labeled them stink, stank, and stunk. Oof. Martin, the more productive of the three. Trell Harris, like you mentioned, is leaving Virginia, the wide receiver one on that team. With Bo Pribula transferring in, these guys are nothing more than late round targets for me. And then Danny Scudero is probably the second wide receiver out of this bunch that I'm going to be investing in. 470 yards after the catch. I don't think he sees the 155 targets that he saw last year with San Jose State. And Colorado's most likely rolling with Julian Lewis, second-year quarterback, was very inaccurate in a small sample size where he was playing, where he was starting for Colorado. So if his accuracy can get a little bit better, I believe he was at like 51 or 52% accuracy on his passes. If he can get that up to 60 to 65%, it bodes well for both of these guys. But I'm expecting Danny Scudero, even though it's a big jump up in competition, I'm expecting Scudero to be the go-to slot wide receiver for Colorado.
You have to imagine that Colorado, I made fun of them bringing in 3 slot wide receivers because they're having to replace their outside production, but Joseph Williams played in the slot last year. He's back for Colorado. You have to think they move him to the outside, right? Because he was mostly an outside guy at Tulsa the year before. And so you'd think they move him outside, probably put Scudero / DeAndre Moore there in the slot, or maybe they move one of those guys to the outside. I don't know how they're going to shift that around, because I don't think they bring in both Scudero and Moore and then put one of them on the bench. Cameron Perry is going to the bench. I'm sorry, but like, no offense to all the Cameron Perry fans out there, but he's going to be on the bench. Scudero and Moore are the 2 wild cards in terms of whatever they do there. I don't know. I'm not super invested in Colorado. I mean, last year, again, like we were all thinking that they would kind of keep going after what they had the year before, and Mari Miller was wide receiver 48, but again, outside guy. And then, let's see, where did Joseph Williams finish? Joseph Williams was wide receiver 215.
Ooh.
So, like, now that might be a little bit higher in fantasy points per game, because I do think he missed a game or two. Not much higher. Wide receiver 197 in fantasy points per game. So, So, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to be super invested in Colorado wide receivers this year. I might go for Joseph Williams again just because he has that year advantage in the system there. We'll see, but not super impressed. All right, we're definitely going to start going through these pretty quickly now again because there's a lot of questions. Again, wide receiver after a certain point just becomes a bunch of question marks. all over the place. But let's talk about
giant bucket of the same guys.
Yeah.
That's what it seems like.
So Terrell Anderson, wide receiver out of NC State, he's headed to USC. My only really note here is Jacoby Lane replacement, because Lane's off to the draft. Nuke Hines is still hanging around, but Anderson very much fits that kind of big outside wide receiver for them. So very much looking at that. Isaiah Horton transferring out of Alabama, headed to Texas A&M. I wrote Casey Concepcion replacement. I honestly doubt it, because I feel like, Horton does kind of play in the slot a little bit, but Concepcion to me is just a much more talented wide receiver. Horton has not really shown much is this his 4th, 5th year in college now? Just doesn't really strike me as a guy that's going to have that late career breakout here. Keon Barry Johnson is an interesting one to me. Again, yes, I can't quit these Phil Longo wide receiver 1 hype deals, but I'm sorry, I gotta pay attention to stuff like this. And Keon Barry Johnson, a guy that Phil Longo recruited at Wisconsin, now joining him here at Sam Houston in a place that desperately needs wide receiver help. Keon Barry Johnson hasn't shown a lot in his career so far, so I don't have much to go on. Yes, I'm grasping at straws probably again here, but if he's a 30th round pick for me, I'll take that all day long. Corey Milliner, the former wide receiver at UAB, got out of that situation. He's now headed to North Texas, where Neil Brown's the play caller there. We'll see how that goes. Neil Brown has had high volume guys before, but they've almost always been super inefficient. Like, how do you get almost 675 yards on 105 targets? Like, that's kind of crazy inefficient. And then the last guy here, Perry Thompson, the wide receiver out of Auburn, former 5-star wide receiver, headed over to Minnesota. Very big get for the Golden Gophers here. My only question is, what do we get out of him? Are we looking at a Lemeke Brockington situation this past year where we get 65 targets, or do we get a Dan Jackson situation where he gets 115 targets? We're going to find out. Chris, your general thoughts on these 5 guys?
Yeah, I'll start with Thompson. 2 seasons at Auburn, didn't really build on his freshman year, with a near tripling of his targets this past year, which is not a good sign. Drake Lindsay, the quarterback, was good enough in his first full year as a starter. If he can build on what he did last year, there is a pathway for Thompson for fantasy. It's just littered with obstacles. Milliner, 38 targets in the games that he was active at UAB. Potential wide receiver 1 for you in for University of North Texas. We're going to need to see what's going to happen in that situation. Isaiah Horton, another player. Expectations are low, hopes are high with Marcel Reed. And then I'm excited, or I wouldn't say excited, I'm enthused to watch the camp battle between Nuke Hines and Terrell Anderson. But it seems like you already have your pick in Terrell Anderson there, Jared.
Oh no, I'm definitely going for Nuke Hines. I think Nuke Hines will be the wide receiver 1. It's just a matter of can we get 2 wide receivers out of this system? Because last year we very much got a funneling of Mekhi Lemon and Jacoby Lane. I think Hines is pretty safe to finish as a CFF relevant wide receiver. It's just a matter of, can Anderson come in and be that big outside play guy? We'll see.
Yep, we will.
All right, let's keep it moving here. Let's talk about 5 more guys. And believe it or not, we're not done after these 5 guys.
Wait, there's more.
There's even more. Javen Nicholas, I talked about him earlier, going from Charlotte. He's going over to Duke. This is a lot more interesting. Before, Walker Eget became our only hope for QB at Duke. Now that Walker Eget's the quarterback, I'm kind of out, which really sucks. Victor Snow, I got to talk about him. He was a top 20 or top 24 wide receiver for CFF last year. He's headed to NC State. NC State does need a lot of help at wide receiver, so I do expect Victor Snow to come in and start.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of how good is that offense going to be. Mm-hmm. We'll find out. Another guy on the screen here is Draylon Miller, the wide receiver formerly of Colorado, now headed over to Baylor. This is a guy that I kind of crapped on last year when people were wanting to draft him out of Colorado, and I said, guys, he is super inefficient, and you know what? He just proved me right, because he was even more inefficient last year than he was his freshman season there. He's going to Baylor. They got nothing at Baylor, so on one hand, I gotta kind of like him, but I also really don't want to like a guy who's averaged less than 9 yards per reception his entire college career here. You can say that he was probably misutilized at Colorado. Probably true. At the same time, I don't want to believe in that. Alex Perry, former wide receiver at FIU going to Illinois. Man, that's a big fat L for the portal. That sucks.
Yep.
I'm not trusting him making that big of a jump. Kind of same with Iverson Hooks at Oregon, although I do kind of see a potential path to him getting that starting slot job. If that's the case, maybe I'm a little interested in him. But man, American Athletic to Big Ten is also such a big jump. I don't want to trust that either. So, Chris, your general thoughts on these 5 guys? What do you got?
I'm lockstep with you with Javon Nicholas with the quarterback situation at Duke. Victor Snow, highly productive, 88 targets alongside Nick McMillian, 15.63 fantasy points per game. So I think they also brought in JoJo Trader, right?
Yes,
From
they just
Miami?
brought him in today.
Yeah, so that's going to be competition for him. 5 of their top 6 players in targets last year for NC State are gone via the transfer portal or graduation. Draylon Miller, great talent. Speed is evident. Lethal with the ball in his hands. 166 yards receiving last year. 122
So
came
lethal,
after
9
the
yards per
catch.
catch.
Not that great, but he was used. If Baylor uses him out of the backfield like Colorado did last year, 45 carries, which is tremendous for a wide receiver, there is a pathway to production for Draylon Miller. I'm out on Alex Perry. And then Iverson Hooks, which can be seen as that Tez Johnson clone who was a dominant wide receiver for Oregon, at least, and for fantasy, saw a bulk of the targets. Kenyon Sadiq last year was the top target getter, but the last year they kind of spread the ball around a lot. Sadiq's targets he capped off with 54, so that's not very promising. Iverson Hooks, the first player since Roddy White and UAB history to have multiple games with 10 or more receptions. So talented dude moving up from UAB to Oregon. It's going to be interesting to see how they're going to use him, where they're going to put him in the mix. They also lost quite a bit of receiving production this year as well. So I'm going to be investing slightly in Victor Snow at NC State, but none of these guys scream, you got to draft these guys. You can't leave your draft without drafting this guy. They're all going to be guys that I'm going to have either a share of or no shares of. I'm not going to be overly invested in either of these wide receivers.
Yeah, I would agree. Again, Hooks may be the only one I'm really kind of looking at here, and that's going to mostly come from the fact of there being a surprise announcement that Dante Moore and Iverson Hooks are actually adoptive brothers, like Tez Johnson and Bo Nix were. So, all right, we got 5 more guys to discuss here. And again, as you can kind of tell, we're definitely getting down there. And some of you are probably looking at some of these guys this far down the list, and you're like, how have we waited this long to discuss this? Well, here you go. Devin McBewen, wide receiver at UTSA, shocked a lot of us when Ohio State, who does not take in a lot of transfers at wide receiver, took in Devin McBewen. That's obviously a good sign if you trust Ryan Day and his recruitment. I personally, the more I think about it, the more I really don't like this landing spot for McBewen. He already wasn't super efficient down to the American Athletic level. I really don't see the path to him doing better than that all of a sudden in the Big Ten. Again, we'll definitely find out. Nick McMillan, another top wide receiver from CFF last year. He is heading over to Kansas, which is just a real rough landing spot. Again, I think last year was probably the best case scenario we can feel like we can get out of Lance Leopold offense for wide receivers, and that was 68 targets for Emmanuel Henderson. And I was like, I don't know if I really want this. So sorry, Nick McMillan owners. I just don't see it, unfortunately. And then we got the 2 Ohio State wide receivers here in Quincy Porter and Mylan Graham. 2 guys that have not seen the field much for Ohio State their first couple of years. Obviously, Mylan Graham got a little bit more run this year, but they're both headed to Notre Dame. Notre Dame's losing Malachi Fields and Will Pollak, so definitely some spots opening up there. But unless Mike Denbrock takes a look at these 2 guys who haven't produced much so far in their career and thinks, this is my next Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas, I really doubt we're going to see much CFF relevance from either of these 2 guys. As Austin would say, again, beware of the transferring year 1-0. Both those guys fit that to a T. I'm not going to draft either one of them going to Notre Dame.
Yeah, that's fair.
DJ Jordan, the guy I'm keeping an eye on there at Arizona. Brett Brennan loves his outside wide receivers. So does Noah Fifita. We saw it last year with Chris Hudson, 87 targets in 11 games for him. Obviously, Tedero McMillan had the monster season he had. If Jordan can lock down one of those outside spots, that might be interesting there. And then, Chris, I'll ask you with Quasi Gilmer. Last year, we did not get a typical wide receiver one from Dana Holgerson in that Nebraska offense. Do we get that at Quasi Gilmer, or do we kind of bet on maybe Ja'Cory Barner or Nazea Hunter making a year 2 jump in this system, or do we just avoid all of them again this year? What do you think?
I'm avoiding at least Quasi Gilmer in this wide receiver room. I don't think he takes over that role that was left behind. I just it's just going to be hard for me to roster him. All things considered, DJ Jordan, Spivey, and Chris Hunter are still enrolled at Arizona, so it's going to be tough for me to see a pathway to production for him. I'm lockstep with you with Quincy Porter and Mylan Graham. Won't be investing. Nick McMillian is probably the wide receiver on this list. I know you're not too high on him, but he might be the only wide receiver on this list that I do have shares in. He had tail of 2 seasons last year, made himself some money with the back half of his season. First half stats, 31 yards receiving and 2.6 targets per game. So 31 yards receiving per game, 2.6 targets per game, 1 touchdown, averaged 5.3 fantasy points. Second half of the season, 132 yards receiving per game, 11 targets per game, 2 touchdowns, and averaged 19.3 fantasy points per game. Emmanuel Henderson's still there as well, and I'm assuming Henderson to be the wide receiver 1 for Kansas. So I'm not overly excited about Nick McMillian's spot here. And then Devin McEwen, can't battle, fast guy, speedy wide receiver, can't battle with Chris Henry Jr., the incoming freshman, who I think is going to be potentially locked in to that wide receiver 2 or 3 role for Ohio State.
Is Chris Henry expected to kind of be an outside guy or a slot receiver for Ohio State? Do we kind of know that yet?
We don't.
Because that's gonna be a real big tell here, right? Because like McMillan,
yes,
there's no way he starts on the outside for UTSA.
No.
Like, if Henry is going to be the second outside guy, maybe McMillan has a chance. But even then, Brandon Inniss is still hanging around, right? Not that Brandon Inniss is, a world beater or anything like that, but, he's a more talented guy, has been at Ohio State longer, at least talented in terms of his recruiting pedigree, I should say. Like, I don't know. Again, the McMillan thing, it worries me quite a bit here, so... All right, let's try to finish up pretty quickly here. I'll throw out some more names that are just like guys I'm keeping an eye on. Noah Rogers goes from NC State to Alabama. Justice Lowe goes from Oregon to San Diego State. I mentioned Horatio Fields currently at Mizzou. We'll see if that changes. Cincinnati adds 2 wide receivers in Cade Wolford out of Kent State and Giovanni Gibson out of Oklahoma. Keeping my eye on those 2 guys. UAB adds CJ Smith out of Memphis, a very speedy wide receiver there. We'll see how they adapt him, if he even makes the starting lineup. I don't know. Miami adds Cam Vaughn out of West Virginia, and as of right now, you would expect him to potentially be that outside wide receiver for Miami next year, but this leads us right into our top uncommitted section here at the end, and I didn't bother making a graphic because there's really only one wide receiver that is still left to be committed, and he, like his quarterback, is in the midst of a bunch of legal drama right now, so we don't even know what's going to happen to them right now.
Yeah,
but Cooper Barkate, wide receiver out of Duke, if he's able to transfer, all indications are he's going to Miami. And if he does that, he's a top 30 wide receiver for me. And even with Malachi Tony there, right? Like, 1, his quarterback's coming with him, so he's going to want to favor him. 2, those outside wide receivers from Miami have been pretty quietly productive the last couple of years. And so I would be willing to bet on Cooper Barkate if he goes to Miami. Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm with you there. If he goes to Miami, he's going to be a target of mine. He's going with his former quarterback, Darian Mensah. Hopefully that they both go to Miami, but I'm going to be invested in Cooper Barkate. Absolutely.
Alrighty, well, been a long show, Chris. Again, I'm really putting you through the ringer with these first 2 shows. Like you know what you're getting into now with how long these transfer shows go now. But hopefully things
Yes, sir.
definitely settle out from here. We got a lot of great content coming up for you guys. We got tight ends and FCS transfers the next week. Then the week after that, we will have the way too early CFF mock draft for you guys for this upcoming year. Chris, you were a part of that, and so excited to get your analysis and 11 other CFF fantasy analysts analysis on that. That's gonna be a ton of fun. We'll be breaking that down the week after that as well. Then we got coaching changes. We got a ton of great stuff in the next couple of months here. But Chris, glad you could join me, man. Gotta enjoy the start of the season, man. And with that, we've come to the end of our show. Appreciate all of you guys out there for listening. If you have not already, make sure you leave a like, a comment, and a subscribe if you're watching this on the YouTube side of things. If you're on the podcast side of things, make sure you follow the show, leave a 5-star review wherever you can. Make sure you check out the rest of the Campus to Canton podcast network for shows ranging on pretty much anything you can think of related to the college fantasy game. And we'll see you guys back here next Monday where we'll discuss those tight end and FCS transfers. Until then, really appreciate all of you guys and I hope you guys have a wonderful and blessed week. See y'all.